In 2004, a 16-year-old girl named Amber Marie Rose was driving her Chevrolet Cobalt down a highway in Georgia. She wasn't speeding, the road was clear, then her car lost all power. Engine off, steering locked, airbags never deployed. She died on impact. Police ruled it an accident. But General Motors already knew exactly what had happened. Their own engineers had identified the fault months earlier and said nothing. Not to Amber's family, not to regulators, not to anyone, because admitting they knew would mean admitting every death that followed was not an accident. It was a consequence. This is the story of a 57-cent part and the 13 years GM spent making sure you never found out about it. 20 reasons, all documented, all proven. Reason number 1, GM engineers flagged the defect before a single car was sold. The Chevrolet Cobalt was still in development in 2001 when GM's own engineers discovered the problem. During pre-production testing, they identified that the ignition switch had a detente torque specification. The force needed to keep the key in position that was dangerously low, low enough that a heavy keychain or even a bump in the road could cause the key to slip from run to accessory while the car was moving. If that happened, engine off, power steering gone, airbags disabled, at highway speed. The engineers wrote it up. They submitted a formal change request. They flagged it as a safety concern before the car ever reached a single customer. GM had the warning, in writing, before production began. Reason number 2, the fix cost 57 cents. The proposed solution was a slightly redesigned switch with a higher torque specification. Simple, straightforward, proven to work. The cost, 57 cents per vehicle. GM's product development committee reviewed the request and rejected it. The internal documentation states the fix did not meet the company's value threshold, the minimum cost-benefit ratio required to approve a design change. In 2003, GM produced approximately 150,000 Cobalts in the first model year alone. The total cost of the fix across that first year of production, $85,000. For a company reporting over $180 billion in annual revenue, they said no to $85,000. The Cobalt went into production with the defective switch installed. Reason number 3, they confirmed the defect within 1 year of launch. The Cobalt went on sale in late 2003. Within months, complaint reports began arriving. Drivers reporting sudden power loss at highway speeds, unresponsive steering, and airbags failing to deploy in serious crashes. By 2004, GM had received enough reports to open a formal internal investigation called Project Delphi. Their engineers tested the vehicle, they replicated the fault. They confirmed that a heavy keychain could cause the ignition switch to slip from run to accessory during normal driving, exactly as had been warned during development 3 years earlier. 1 year into production, confirmed defect, confirmed deaths. GM did not issue a recall. Reason number 4, their official solution was use a lighter keychain. Instead of a recall, GM issued Technical Service Bulletin 04-08-49-007. A Technical Service Bulletin is not a recall notice. It is a quiet document sent only to dealerships and mechanics. Vehicle owners never see it. It carries no legal obligation to notify the public. The bulletin acknowledged that ignition switches were slipping from run to accessory during driving. It acknowledged the engine would shut off. It acknowledged the airbags would not deploy, and it told mechanics to advise customers to use lighter keychains. That was the official GM response to evidence that their cars were shutting down at highway speed and killing people. A keychain recommendation, sent to mechanics, not to owners, not to the families of people who had already died. Reason number 5, they spread the defective switch. Across 6 models, rather than fixing the problem, GM continued expanding it. Between 2003 and 2007, the same defective ignition switch was installed across 6 different vehicle models: the Chevrolet Cobalt, the Pontiac G5, the Saturn Ion, the Chevrolet HHR, the Pontiac Solstice, and the Saturn Sky. 6 models, multiple model years, all sold to customers with no warning. Every one of those vehicles could lose all power and disable its airbags if the key slipped in the ignition. GM knew this when they put those cars on sale. Reason number 6, people were dying and the crash reports said accident. Here is why the cover-up worked for so long. When the ignition switch fails and a car crashes, the key often resets itself before investigators arrive. The physical evidence of what caused the crash disappears with the momentum of the collision. Police arriving at the scene see a crashed car with the key in the normal position. They write, "Driver error, road conditions, inexperience." In 2006, Megan Phillips was killed in Maryland when her Saturn Ion lost power, ruled an accident. In that same year, Natasha Weigel, 18 years old, and Amy Raidmaker, 15, were killed when their Cobalt crashed after an ignition switch failure in Wisconsin. Ruled an accident. These families were told their loved ones had made mistakes. Some of them spent years believing it. GM's engineers understood exactly why the physical evidence was disappearing. They knew the switch reset itself on impact. They knew investigators would never find it. They said nothing. Reason number 7. A federal safety agency investigated, and GM misled them. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the federal agency responsible for vehicle safety in the United States, opened an investigation into Cobalt power loss complaints in 2007. They reviewed hundreds of consumer reports. They had crash data. They had airbag non-deployment records. In June 2010, they closed the investigation. Their conclusion: insufficient evidence of a safety defect. Later investigations would reveal that during the NHTSA inquiry, GM had provided information about the Cobalt's ignition switch that failed to disclose the Project Delphi findings, the history of internal complaints, and the 2006 switch redesign. The federal regulator, whose job was to protect the public, investigated the exact defect that was killing people and closed the case without finding it, because GM made sure they wouldn't. Reason number 8. Brooke Melton's family refused to accept accident. On March 10, 2010, a 29-year-old nurse named Brooke Melton was driving her Chevrolet Cobalt on a rain-slicked highway in Georgia when her car suddenly lost power. She crossed into oncoming traffic and was struck by another vehicle. The airbags did not deploy. Brooke Melton died at the scene. Police ruled it driver error. Her parents, Ken and Beth Melton, hired an independent mechanical engineer to examine the wreckage. He found the ignition switch in the accessory position. The car's data recorder confirmed the engine had been off at the moment of impact. The Meltons sued GM in 2011. During the legal discovery process, GM was required to hand over internal documents. Those documents showed that GM had known about the ignition switch defect since at least 2004, 6 years before Brooke Melton died on that highway. The case was settled, the documents were sealed. GM admitted no wrongdoing. Brooke Melton was 29 years old. Reason number 9. Ray DiGiorgio fixed the switch without telling anyone. In 2006, a GM engineer named Ray DiGiorgio quietly approved a redesign of the ignition switch. The new switch had a higher torque specification, the exact fix that engineers had proposed and GM had rejected in 2001. DiGiorgio approved it. New cars began coming off the line with the fixed switch installed. He told no one outside his immediate team. No recall of existing vehicles, no safety notice to owners of pre-2006 models, no disclosure to the NHTSA, no announcement of any kind. The fix existed, it worked, and the hundreds of thousands of people driving pre-2006 Cobalts, Ions, and G5s, cars with the original defective switch, had no way of knowing their vehicles hadn't been updated. DiGiorgio fixed the switch for new production and left everyone else on the road with the defective one. Reason number 10. He changed the switch but kept the same part number. This is the decision that sits at the center of the entire cover-up. In automotive engineering, every component has a unique part number. When a part is modified, even slightly, a new part number is assigned. This is how engineers, lawyers, mechanics, and safety investigators track which version of a component is in which vehicle. When Ray DiGiorgio approved the redesigned switch in 2006, he did not assign a new part number. The old switch and the new switch carried identical documentation. The practical consequences were enormous. If an attorney investigating a crash pulled the part number, they got the same records regardless of whether the car had the defective switch or the fixed one. The redesign was invisible in GM's own documentation system, and when DiGiorgio testified under oath in the Melton case that the switch had never been modified, that statement was technically supported by the part number record, even though it was factually false. When investigators later asked DiGiorgio why he had kept the same part number, he said he did not remember making that decision. Former U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas, who led the independent investigation into GM, said there was no benign explanation for it. Reason number 11. He lied about it under oath. In the Melton case deposition, Ray DiGiorgio testified under oath that the ignition switch had never been changed since it entered production. He said no modifications had been made. He said the switch in production vehicles was the same switch that had been designed in 2001. Every one of those statements was false. DiGiorgio had personally approved the redesign in 2006. He had signed the documentation. The new switch was physically different from the old one. Different internal geometry, different torque specification, different performance characteristics. He testified under oath that none of that had happened. It was not until a separate attorney in a different case physically obtained a switch from a dealership parts department and compared it to the engineering specifications that the discrepancy became impossible to deny. Reason number 12. The GM nod was a company-wide culture. DiGiorgio did not operate in isolation. He operated inside a culture. GM engineers had a name for what happened when safety concerns were raised in meetings. The GM nod. Someone would present data. A problem would be identified. People would listen. There would be discussion. And then at the end of the meeting, nothing would be decided. No action item, no deadline, no owner. Everyone would nod. The nod meant this concern has been acknowledged. It did not mean someone will fix this. It meant this meeting is over. The Valukas report, the independent investigation commissioned by GM's own board, documented meeting after meeting going back to 2004 where the ignition switch defect was discussed. Engineers presented crash data, safety concerns were raised, the data showed people were dying, and then everyone nodded and went home. 124 deaths accumulated in the silence after those nods. Reason number 13. Settlements were used to bury. The evidence over the years between 2004 and 2013, multiple families filed lawsuits related to ignition switch crashes. In each case where GM's internal documents were produced during discovery, documents proving GM had known about the defect, the cases were settled quietly, and as a condition of settlement, the documents were sealed. The attorneys who had seen the evidence were prohibited from discussing it. The families who received compensation were prohibited from speaking publicly. The documents went back into the dark. This pattern, produce documents in discovery, settle before trial, seal everything, meant that no ignition switch case ever reached a jury. No internal GM document was ever made public through litigation. No judge ever ruled on the evidence. The cover-up used the legal system as one of its primary tools. Reason number 14. It took an independent engineer to break the pattern. The sealed documents in the Melton case contained proof that GM had known about the defect since 2004. Lance Cooper, the attorney who had handled the Melton case, was now working on additional ignition switch cases. He could not use the sealed Melton documents directly, but he knew what he was looking for. In 2013, through a separate discovery process in a different case, Cooper obtained a physical ignition switch from a GM dealership parts department. He sent it to an engineer for analysis. The engineer's finding, the switch was physically different from the switch documented in GM's official specifications under the same part number. That discrepancy, a physical part that didn't match its own documentation, was the thread that unraveled 13 years of concealment. Cooper brought the finding to GM directly. GM could no longer deny it. Reason number 15. GM waited. Weeks after confirming the defect before issuing the recall. On January 31, 2014, GM's engineers confirmed internally that the ignition switch was defective and responsible for deaths. The recall was not issued until February 13, 2014. 13 days passed between the internal confirmation and the public recall announcement. During those 13 days, hundreds of thousands of people were still driving vehicles GM had internally confirmed were dangerous. GM has never fully explained what happened during those 13 days, what discussions took place, what decisions were made, what the delay was for. Federal investigators later cited the delay as evidence that even in the final moments before the scandal became public, GM's instinct was to manage the information rather than protect the public. Reason number 16. The initial recall number was deliberately low when GM finally issued the recall on February 13, 2014. The announced number was 780,000 vehicles. Within days, that number was obviously wrong. Additional models were affected, additional model years. The defective switch had been installed in vehicles GM did not include in the initial recall. Over the following months, GM issued a series of supplemental recalls as the full scope became impossible to ignore. By the end of 2014, the total recalled vehicles stood at approximately 30 million. The gap between 780,000 and 30 million is not a rounding error. Safety advocates argued that the initial low number was a deliberate containment strategy. Announce a small recall, hope the story dies, expand only when forced to. Reason number 17. Mary Barra had been CEO for 29 days when it all collapsed. Mary Barra was named CEO of General Motors on January 15, 2014. 29 days later, the ignition switch recall was announced. Barra had spent her entire career at GM, over 30 years. She knew the company intimately, but she had been in the top role for less than a month when she was forced to appear before the United States Senate and answer for 13 years of institutional failure. Her testimony lasted 2 days. Senators from both parties held up internal documents and read from them directly. Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri looked at Barra and said, "This is a culture of cover-up." Barra repeated throughout both days that she had not known, that the information had not reached her, that the system had failed. What the testimony made clear was that the system had been designed, not accidentally, but through years of accumulated choices, to ensure that information like this never reached the top. The GM nod had protected everyone above it. Reason number 18. 124 official deaths, potentially over 300 real ones. GM appointed attorney Kenneth Feinberg, who had previously administered the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, to manage claims from affected families. To receive compensation, families had to prove their loved one's death was directly caused by the ignition switch defect. They also had to waive their right to sue GM directly. By the time the fund closed, 124 deaths had been officially linked to the defective switch. But the fund's criteria were narrow. Crashes where the switch position couldn't be definitively established were excluded. Cases that had been ruled accidents years earlier, before anyone knew to look for ignition switch failures, were excluded. The Center for Auto Safety estimated the true death toll was more than 300. Some plaintiff attorneys put it higher. The families of the excluded victims received nothing from the fund. Reason number 19. No one went to prison. In September 2015, the Department of Justice announced a settlement with GM. The company paid a $900 million criminal penalty and entered a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning that if GM complied with conditions for 3 years, the charges would be dropped. In 2018, the charges were dropped. Ray DiGiorgio, the engineer who had approved the defective switch, rejected the fix, changed the part without changing the part number, and testified falsely under oath, was fired by GM. He settled civil lawsuits brought against him personally. He was never criminally charged. No GM executive was ever criminally charged. 15 employees were named in the Valukas report as warranting further review. GM fired 5. The rest were cleared. The company that deliberately concealed a safety defect for over a decade, misled federal regulators, allowed at least 124 people to die, and used sealed legal settlements to bury the evidence, paid a fine and walked away. Reason number 20. The total cost was 70 times the price of the fix. Here is the final number. The complete financial cost of the GM ignition switch scandal, $595 million to the Feinberg Compensation Fund, $900 million in federal criminal penalties, approximately $1.5 billion in civil litigation settlements, recall costs, parts, labor, dealer reimbursement, estimated at $4.1 billion. Total, approximately $7 billion. The cost of the 57-cent fix applied to all affected vehicles in 2005 when GM first confirmed the defect internally, approximately $100 million. $7 billion versus $100 million. GM chose not to spend $100 million. They spent $7 billion. And that $7 billion does not include the cost that cannot be measured in money. The 124 confirmed deaths, the potentially hundreds more, the families who were told for years that their children had made mistakes, the grief that was built on a lie told to protect a cost that was less than the price of a cup of coffee per car. 57 cents. That was the price of every single one of those lives to General Motors. 57 cents. Amber money reasons. 20 documented facts from court records, federal investigations, and GM's own internal documents. None of them are disputed. All of them are in the public record. The switch has been fixed, the fine has been paid, the deferred prosecution has expired. The question of whether 57 cents was ever worth more than a human life was answered inside General Motors in 2001. They answered it wrong. If this video changed how you think about the car you're driving, share it, and the next one is already waiting.